At the age of 70, when many people have already chosen to step back from the spotlight, Jimmy Fortune still walks out onto the stage, stands before the audience, and lifts his familiar voice, a voice that can make an entire hall fall silent. What people see is a gentle, humble man who has lived his entire life guided by faith and gospel music. But behind those rounds of applause lies the story of a replacement singer, life and death surgeries, and long nights spent living with the fear that he might never be able to sing again. And even more painfully, in his later years, he was forced to endure the devastating loss of his son. So what exactly has Jimmy Fortune had to go through in order to still be standing here today? And before this story begins, if his voice has ever touched you, leave a heart as a small tribute to the man who sang for so many people, even while carrying his own pain in silence. Every legend carries a private wound. For Jimmy Fortune, it began with a childhood marked by poverty, where music and faith were the rare things that never ran out. Jimmy Fortune was born on the 11th of March, 1955, in Staunton, Virginia, a small town nestled among rolling green hills, where Sunday mornings always began with the steady ringing of church bells. He grew up in a working-class family, the seventh child among 9 siblings. Their old wooden house lacked material comfort, but music and faith existed there as naturally as breathing. Jimmy's father would often sit on the front porch with a guitar resting on his lap. He did not always play a full song, but those scattered chords still drifted through the air each afternoon. His mother sang hymns slow and steady enough to fill the small room as dusk settled in. Jimmy would sit quietly beside her, simply listening. And it was from evenings like these that his voice began to form without lessons, without instruction, growing naturally, like something that had always been there. But behind those peaceful afternoons was a childhood that was anything but calm. Jimmy grew up in a house where alcohol often arrived before words did. There were days when his father came home before nightfall, his steps unsteady, his eyes distant, like those of a different man altogether. The child learned early how to stay silent, not out of obedience, but because silence was the only way to keep the house from descending further into chaos. Years later, Jimmy spoke about it without hesitation. "My father was an alcoholic. It was that bad." There were times when he was too young to fully understand what was happening, yet old enough to have to drive his father home while he was drunk. Jimmy's childhood passed in heavy evenings, the kind where a child never knows what might be waiting on the other side of the door. Many years later, when reflecting on that period, Jimmy did not shy away. On the Dinner Conversations podcast with Ben Isaacs, he spoke briefly, but his words were enough to leave listeners stunned. "My mother poured alcohol down the toilet in desperation, but he would sneak back and drink again. That's how deep the addiction was." Because he grew up in that kind of environment, Jimmy learned early on to find somewhere to escape. He did not turn to complaining, nor did he know how to rebel. The one thing that stayed with him quietly, without judgment, was music. At 8 years old, he found an old guitar thrown away in a trash pile near his house, only 2 strings left, the wooden body scratched and battered, completely forgotten by everyone else. Jimmy took it home and played those 2 strings for years. Later in life, he admitted, "I didn't know what I was playing. I just played because it made me feel better." Those raw, imperfect sounds followed him through long afternoons, becoming a rare refuge during days when there was nothing else to hold on to. Then came Christmas of 1967. His parents gave Jimmy a real guitar. That morning, when he opened the gift, he held the 6-string instrument in his hands and froze. He stared at it for a long time, as if afraid that one blink might make it disappear, then asked softly, almost in a whisper, "Is this a real guitar?" For him, that moment was more than a Christmas present. It was the first time a dream stepped out of imagination, took on shape and weight, and rested quietly in his own hands. Right then, Jimmy turned to his father and said that if he could play the guitar and sing, he would make a living through music. "This is what I want to do," he said, his voice steadier than his years suggested. His father looked at him for a long moment, then shook his head. To him, music was only a pastime after work, something for enjoyment, not a path in life. "You can't make a living doing that," he replied firm, but not unkind. Jimmy didn't argue, but that moment etched itself deeply into his memory. Right then, he would later say, "I understood that music wasn't a hobby. It was everything." His voice was noticed early on during church services, high, clear, and deeply sincere. When Jimmy sang, people didn't think about technique. They remembered the feeling of being soothed, as if someone were singing on their behalf. His dream at the time was so simple it barely needed a name. Jimmy just wanted to sing. And from those quiet, almost invisible performances, Jimmy Fortune's musical path slowly began to take shape, unhurried, yet never off course. After graduating from Nelson County High School, Jimmy Fortune did not step onto anything that could be called a predetermined path. He didn't rush into the entertainment industry, nor did he have any long-term plan for music. By day, Jimmy worked at a car dealership, standing amid polished showrooms, talking about engines and prices, and life simply moved along through repetitive shifts, steady, predictable, and offering no promise of anything ahead. But in the evenings and on weekends, Jimmy always carried his guitar with him. He sang in places where no one came to truly listen to music. Small restaurants, roadside motels, VFW veterans halls, community picnics. Jimmy stood in a corner of the room under dim lights, singing while others ate dinner or ordered another drink. Those nights were almost indistinguishable from one another. He carried his amplifier in from the car himself, adjusted his guitar strings beneath old neon lights, and then began to sing. No introduction, no opening words. Just like that, as if it were a habit formed long ago. During that period, Jimmy quietly carried a question with him. Does my music really mean anything? On dark roads leading home, the Virginia wind beat steadily against the windshield. He drove slowly, thinking about his parents, about the old hymns of his childhood, and whispered to himself, almost under his breath, if God had given him this voice, there had to be a reason. And so, day after day, Jimmy passed through small, nameless stages. No one called his name, no one knew who he was, and no one could have imagined what was quietly waiting for him ahead. Until one fateful evening in 1982. Jimmy Fortune stood on stage just as he had on countless other nights at a winter resort where music was usually nothing more than background noise for conversation. The microphone crackled slightly. The clinking of glasses drowned out the sound of the guitar. No one was there to truly listen. But that night, in the room, there was one man who listened differently. He sat still through the entire set. He watched how Jimmy took his breath, watched how he held a high note just a little longer than usual. That man was Lou DeWitt, the legendary tenor voice of the Statler Brothers. At the time, Lou was battling severe Crohn's disease, an illness that turned every tour into an ordeal and made his future on stage increasingly uncertain. When the final song ended, Lou didn't stand up right away. He waited a few seconds, then walked over to Jimmy, and with just one sentence, spoken softly, "I think you should audition for the Statler Brothers." A simple sentence, but to Jimmy, it felt like a door quietly opening in front of him. On the 28th of January 1982, Jimmy Fortune drove himself to Nashville. No fanfare, no announcements, just a private audition extended directly by the Statler Brothers following Lou DeWitt's suggestion. The room wasn't large, but the pressure was unmistakable. Standing before Jimmy was not an ordinary audience, but a band that had been together for decades, Grammy winners since 1965, dominant figures in country music throughout the late 1970s. And now, they were facing a void no one wanted to name. Lou's tenor voice, a defining part of their identity whose absence was immediately noticeable. Jimmy didn't try to explain who he was. He didn't recount his past. He didn't ask for a chance. He simply stood there and sang. Then the room fell silent. Not the polite silence that follows a performance, but the kind of silence that forces people to stop and listen. And that silence answered everything. That very evening, Jimmy Fortune stepped onto the stage with the Statler Brothers for the first time at a show in Savannah, Georgia. It was just another regular night, but it was the night audiences began to hear a new voice. Unfamiliar, yet not disruptive to what they had loved for so many years. At first, Jimmy only joined the tour, filling in when Lou was no longer strong enough to keep traveling. But Crohn's disease did not grant Lou more time. And by August 1982, Jimmy Fortune was signed as an official member of the Statler Brothers. From that moment on, Jimmy Fortune stepped into a position few would ever wish for, and even fewer could endure. He didn't just join a band. He stepped into the shadow of a legend. Lou DeWitt was not a voice that could simply be replaced. He was collective memory itself, something so ingrained that the absence of a single harmony felt wrong. And so, every time Jimmy lifted his voice, he wasn't merely being heard, he was being measured. That comparison was never loud. It lived quietly in the audience rows, where people sat with their arms crossed, waiting to see how long this new guy would last. In newspaper articles about the Statler Brothers that barely mentioned his name, and in applause that was polite enough to acknowledge him, yet not warm enough to fully trust him. Jimmy understood this all too well. He was not allowed to make mistakes. He could not sound too much like Lou, and he could not sound too different either. Every night on stage was a test that lasted until the lights went out. The pressure didn't end when he stepped off stage. It followed him back to the hotel room after the show, onto the tour bus at 3 a.m, and lingered in those brief phone calls home, where he never quite knew how to explain the exhaustion of standing in the middle of applause while feeling completely drained. And that was Jimmy Fortune's first tragedy. Stepping into the dream of his life, yet having no right to be weak inside it. He did not exist simply by replacing Lou DeWitt. He existed by keeping the band breathing and by beginning to trade away things that would never appear on stage. Starting in 1983, Jimmy Fortune began to write. Late at night, when the stage lights were off, he would sit alone with his guitar, and a song was born, Elizabeth.
Oh, Elizabeth, I'm sure.
That song was not created to conquer the charts. It was more like a letter sent back to those who had given him a place to stand, and especially to Lou DeWitt, whom Jimmy always spoke of with the respect of someone who came after, never as the man he replaced. When Elizabeth went on the air, it didn't explode. It spread slowly, held on to by radio stations day after day, recognized by listeners as gratitude placed exactly where it belonged. And then, on an entirely ordinary morning, the name the Statler Brothers quietly returned to the #1 spot on the Billboard chart in a way that made the entire band simply look at one another in silence, enough to know that this was not something that could be called luck. My Only Love came afterward, written during a period when Jimmy's personal life was beginning to fracture in ways the stage would never reveal. The song carried a gentle melody and restrained lyrics, like an attempt to hold on to balance while everything around him was moving too fast. When it reached the top of the charts, people spoke little about its writer, but they listened to it for a long time in night drives, in hotel rooms, in moments of quiet that even Jimmy himself had not yet found words for. A year later, Too Much on My Heart was born, no longer an effort to hold things together, but a moment when Jimmy admitted he was carrying too much inside. The song found its listeners in silence, people who nodded almost imperceptibly as the music played. It reached #1 on Billboard in the familiar way of the Statler Brothers, quietly, yet deeply enough to stay. 3 Billboard #1 songs didn't change the Statler Brothers' direction, but they returned the band to where they truly belonged, back on the road. The tour schedule gradually filled, then became completely packed, night after night with hardly a pause in between. One city barely finished clearing the stage before preparations began for the next stop. Towns that thought they had already said goodbye now saw the band's name appear on posters again and again and again. At that point, the Statler Brothers were no longer just a familiar name. They became a band audiences wanted to see with their own eyes, not just hear on the radio. Tickets sold out earlier than usual, halls filled before the doors officially opened, and people stood up from the very first songs, singing along to harmonies they had memorized by heart, as if afraid that if they didn't hold tightly to the moment, the band might disappear once more. In 1988, More Than a Name on a Wall was released. The song didn't need a chart position to remain. It echoed through memorial services, in rooms where families had just lost someone they loved, and before names quietly carved into cold stone. There, the song existed not as a hit, but as an act of bowing one's head slow, respectful, and sometimes that was enough. The final years of the 1990s passed in a familiar rhythm. The Statler Brothers were still on stage, still singing harmonies that had become part of America's collective memory, still selling tickets steadily in a way very few bands of their era could manage. But behind the lights, something was changing very slowly, not in the music, but in how they looked toward the road ahead. They had been there for too long. More than 4 decades standing behind the same line of microphones, sharing the same tour schedules, the same overnight buses, the same hurried meals. There was nothing left to prove, no peak left to reclaim, and nothing left to fix. The Statler Brothers did not break up because of conflict. They did not part ways because inspiration ran out. They stopped because they understood something very few artists dare to name. Some bands should step off the stage on their own before the stage forces them to leave. That decision did not come from a loud meeting. It was spoken slowly, scattered across conversations between tour stops, during quiet evenings backstage after the applause had faded. Don Reed once said they didn't want to drag things on just to prove they were still there. They wanted to close the chapter while everything was still intact. Their voices, their respect, and the audience's affection. And so, they chose a farewell tour, passing through the places that had once lifted them up as a final bow. On the 26th of October, 2002, the Statler Brothers stepped off the stage after their final performance. 4 men stood side by side one last time, sang the songs that had followed them their entire lives, and then walked away in silence enough to close a story that had completed its journey. For Jimmy Fortune, that moment carried a different meaning. He was the one who came later, the one who entered when the band was already formed, already had history, already carried memories so deep that every note came with a past. For 20 years, Jimmy did not stand at the center. He stood exactly where he needed to stand, wrote songs that helped the band keep breathing, and accepted that his name would always come after the name Statler Brothers. Later, Jimmy looked back on that time and admitted, "When that door closed, for the first time I had to ask myself, if I'm no longer the tenor voice of the Statler Brothers, then who am I?" And Jimmy chose to walk alone. Not to prove anything, but because it was time for him to finally hear his own voice. His solo career began quietly, without fanfare, the way someone accustomed to standing within harmony steps into the open space ahead. Slower, closer, and just enough for him to continue singing to the rhythm of his own life. His first solo album, When One Door Closes, 2003, did not try to escape the shadow of the Statler Brothers. It didn't need to. The songs carried familiar tones, country, gospel, storytelling, melodies, but Jimmy's voice no longer had to stand in the exact place within a 4-part harmony. It stood alone, more exposed, and because of that, more vulnerable. Jimmy went on to release 3 more albums: I Believe, Windows, Lessons. The titles themselves were quiet, understated, promising no grand breakthroughs. They felt more like internal markers of a man who had lived under stage lights for a very long time and now chose to stand in just enough light to see the audience and be seen in return. He sang more about faith, about family, about questions that didn't require answers. Jimmy's music during this period was no longer meant to conquer a market. It was meant to preserve connection. A new chapter opened when Jimmy partnered with the Gaither Music Group and released Hits and Hymns. That album brought him to a different audience, people who listened in churches, in small gatherings, in moments when comfort mattered more than entertainment. There, Jimmy's voice found a natural refuge. No need to perform, no need to compete, just honesty. In the years that followed, Jimmy continued to tour. But it was no longer the relentless, unbreaked cycle of the Statler Brothers era. He chose fewer dates, smaller venues, places where people came to listen, truly listen, rather than simply to see a familiar name. Some evenings, Jimmy would talk about Lou DeWitt. At other times, he spoke of the Statler Brothers not as a sealed-off memory, but as living tissue, something still flowing through him. He never cut himself off from the past. He simply learned how to carry it without letting it weigh him down. In 2007, the Statler Brothers were inducted into the Gospel Music Hall of Fame. In 2008, they entered the Country Music Hall of Fame. Formal ceremonies, speeches, long applause. Jimmy stood there beside the men who had walked with him for 2 decades, no longer the young guy Lou DeWitt chose in 1982, but an inseparable part of the story itself. Nothing more needed to be said. His place spoke for him. Later on, when Jimmy joined Brothers of the Heart, he once again stood within harmony, but this time among men who had already traveled far enough to no longer be in a hurry. There was no pressure to prove anything. Music became a meeting point, a place where people sang because they wanted to stay together a little longer, and where each performance ended with more smiles than tension. But when the stage lights softened, there were spaces that music could not fill, and that was when cracks in Jimmy's personal life, long unseen by the public, began to show. Jimmy Fortune married for the first time at just 17 years old. At an age when most people were still learning who they were, Jimmy stepped straight into the role of a husband, and soon after, a father. That marriage did not begin with wrongdoing, but with immaturity, the kind no one fully recognizes until they are carrying responsibilities larger than their capacity. A young family, children, financial pressure, and a musical dream just beginning to flicker, still without a clear shape. Jimmy stood in the middle of it all, unsure where to place his feet first. Music at that time was not bright stage lights or applause. It was nights singing in small bars, long drives that promised nothing at the end of the road. And that reality created an unavoidable conflict. A family needs steady presence. Music does not. And at 17, Jimmy did not yet have the experience to understand that some choices cannot coexist at the same time. Later, he admitted, "Looking back, I understand that my own lack of maturity contributed to the breakdown of my first marriage, not because there wasn't love, but because we stepped into adult life too early." That marriage ended, leaving an early scar on Jimmy's inner life. He carried not only the guilt of a failed husband, but also the helplessness of a young father, learning how to split time and responsibility while he himself was still unsteady. After his first divorce, Jimmy entered a second marriage in the late 1970s and early 1980s, just as his musical path began opening wider. He was older then, but still not old enough to escape familiar conflicts. This time, they arrived quietly. Tour schedules grew heavier, trips became longer. Being away from home turned into a norm until no one asked about it anymore. And once again, family life receded into the background. There was no scandal, no loud breakup, just two people gradually falling out of rhythm. One accustomed to back-to-back performances and constantly changing cities, the other needing a steady life, needing presence long enough to call it togetherness. That distance didn't appear overnight, but by the time it was noticed, it had grown too large to bridge. The second marriage also ended, leaving a difficult truth behind: 2 broken marriages, even as his career continued to rise. During that period, Jimmy Fortune did not look like a man who had won. He carried the endurance of someone who became a father very young, who still had to work, still had to travel, still had to stand under the lights while his private life grew thinner by the day. He rarely spoke about those things. His music didn't directly tell family stories, but it slowed down, grew heavier, as if too much was being held behind the lyrics, things that had nowhere to go except forward. It wasn't until 1998 that Jimmy Fortune's personal life shifted into a different rhythm. Nina entered his life not through stage lights, nor through crowded performances. She came at an entirely ordinary time in the midst of days when Jimmy was used to packing suitcases, leaving home, and treating forward motion as instinct. They didn't meet in a carefully staged romantic moment, but in simple conversations, where Jimmy didn't need to be the tenor voice of the Statler Brothers, just a man worn down by years on the road. Nina didn't ask where he was going next. She asked whether he had eaten dinner. She didn't ask about tour schedules or stages. And that calm presence unsettled Jimmy in a strangely unfamiliar way, because it had been a very long time since anyone stayed long enough to care about such small things. Later, Jimmy summed up that feeling simply: "With her, I no longer felt like I had to go anywhere." On the 10th of October, 1998, Jimmy Fortune married Nina. No spotlight, no announcements, just a decision made after many years of being more accustomed to leaving than staying. After that marriage, Jimmy began to live differently in ways that were hard to notice unless you looked closely. He no longer accepted tour dates by reflex, but paused to consider what each trip would take away. He spoke less about family, but when he did, there was a new care in his words, as if he had learned how to protect what he did not want to lose again. Behind the stage, Nina never sought visibility. She arrived early, sat back in dimly lit rows, and left when the show ended. She didn't interfere with the music or take part in career decisions, but the consistency of small things, regular meals, rearranged travel plans, unhurried evenings gradually created a different rhythm for Jimmy, a rhythm he had missed for far too long while always being on the move. Jimmy's family at that point was a complex structure built from past and present relationships, with a total of 7 children. Not a neatly defined family by simple standards, but one assembled over time through loss, adjustment, and acceptance. What mattered was not the number, but how Jimmy saw it not as a mistake to hide, but as a life he could not separate from who he was. Those who came to know Jimmy later often described his family as close-knit, modest, and unshowy. There was no attempt to paint a picture of a perfect family, just shared trips, late dinners after shows, and steady presence, the very thing Jimmy had lacked in his early marriages. He never claimed to have done everything right, but it was clear that he had learned how to stay. And just as life finally seemed to find a quiet balance, Jimmy Fortune's own body began to speak in ways he could no longer ignore. The signs did not come all at once. They appeared scattered through days that seemed perfectly ordinary. A morning when he felt more tired than usual, a flight of stairs where he had to stop halfway, a breath that suddenly shortened and then returned on its own. He was used to the aches and pains of years on the road, used to a body that complained and then fell silent again, so he kept brushing it aside. He kept singing, kept traveling, kept standing under the lights, telling himself it was just age moving a little closer. Until one day, the exhaustion refused to go away. Jimmy went to see a doctor. At first, simply for peace of mind. But the tests lasted longer than expected, and the doctors' faces grew tense in a way that needed no explanation. When they finally spoke the conclusion, the room seemed to sink inward. Several arteries in his heart were severely blocked, some nearly completely, 99%, 95%. and that heart had been working far too long without rest. There was no room left for delay, no option other than immediate intervention. On the 15th of February 2023, Jimmy Fortune entered the operating room for a quintuple bypass surgery, 5 coronary arteries rerouted. It was not a minor adjustment, but a complete reopening of a system that had been slowly strangled over the years. At an age when many had already stepped away from the stage, Jimmy lay still on the operating table. For the first time, not holding a microphone, not hearing music, with only his heartbeat traced in cold, wavering lines. The surgery took place in absolute silence. No lights, no audience, no music. Only family waiting beyond the door, and one man facing, for the first time, the very real possibility that he might not return as before. When he woke, Jimmy understood that this was no longer a story about coming back stronger, but something far simpler, whether he would still have enough time to keep standing there at all. The recovery was long and uncomfortable. Jimmy was forced to cancel several shows, a rarity throughout his career. With no packed schedule to cling to, he had to remain still through long days, listening to his body in a way he never had before. Slow steps, a dull, persistent ache, and sleepless nights when worry refused to leave, even alongside pain medication. During that period, Jimmy said that faith was no longer something to speak about or share. It became a quiet habit, a place to hold on to while the body had not yet healed and the future remained uncertain. I didn't ask for anything great. I just asked for enough strength to stay here one more day.
So thankful that God spared me a heart attack.
His recovery moved at a measured pace. Some mornings he woke to realize his body was still not as ready as he hoped. Some days, progress could only be measured by being a little less tired than the day before. But it was in those uneventful stretches that Jimmy began to understand this was no longer about whether he would return or not, but about the rhythm with which he would live the rest of his life. And during that recovery, Jimmy Fortune did not face his body alone. Nina was there not as a supervisor, but as a new rhythm placed beside him. Steady, discreet, and without pressure. She reorganized small things Jimmy had never noticed before. Schedules, meals, pauses between activities. Those seemingly minor details gradually replaced the familiar pace of touring life, creating a different order for days no longer anchored by the stage. And then, just as his body had begun to stabilize after months of fighting illness, another shock arrived without warning, leaving no time for anyone to prepare. On the 15th of October 2024, Lester James, Jimmy Fortune, Jr., Jimmy's son, passed away at the age of 51. The death came suddenly, without notice, offering no one a chance to ease into the painful reality. For Jimmy, this pain had nothing to do with stages or audiences anymore. It was simply the pain of a father losing a child, a kind of pain beyond words. People spoke of his son as a positive, joyful man, devoted to his community and active in church life. But to Jimmy, those descriptions suddenly felt unnecessary. He was simply the child Jimmy had once held in his arms, taught and watched grow up through years when he was not always there. This was considered the greatest shock of Jimmy's life, greater than any professional setback, greater even than the times he had nearly lost his life to illness. The pain of losing a child is often quiet. It lives in long silences, in mornings when everything seems exactly the same. Jimmy did not publicize that grief or turn it into a story for sympathy. But those close to him noticed. From that point on, his voice grew deeper, the tempo slowed, and there were moments when he chose silence instead of song. At this stage, faith was no longer a place for answers. It was simply a support that allowed him to endure. Jimmy never said he understood the meaning of this loss. He only said he was learning how to keep living without needing to understand everything. Some pains do not come to teach us anything. They simply remind us that there are wounds that never heal. We can only carry them forward. Today, at 70, Jimmy Fortune no longer stands on stage as someone who needs to be seen. He lives in Tennessee, among old musical roads, where people do not ask how famous you once were, but whether you still have something honest enough to sing. His life now does not resemble that of a retired legend, nor a chase to reclaim past glory. It feels more like a conscious staying with music as a way of being, nothing more, nothing less. Jimmy's rhythm of life is now measured by health and emotion, not by the number of shows. He still writes, still records, still steps on stage when his body allows, but each appearance is a choice. Those performances are no longer about impressing or proving ability. They have become places where he shares a voice that has passed through exhaustion, fracture, and moments when it nearly disappeared from music altogether. After heart surgery, Jimmy's presence before the public carries a different tone. He does not return to mark a rebirth, but to continue a journey not yet finished. In Brothers of the Heart, he stands beside voices of the same generation men who no longer sing to surpass one another, but to hold on to what helped them survive life itself. There are no leading or supporting roles there, only voices blending like marks of time unchanged, yet settled. Jimmy Fortune has never placed money at the center of his life story. He does not speak of wealth, nor build an image of success around possessions. But more than 4 decades on stage, with thousands of performances and songs that outlived their moment, have given him a solid financial foundation. His net worth is estimated at around $7 to $8 million, not to expand fame, but to buy freedom. Freedom to choose stages, freedom to decline invitations that no longer fit, and freedom to keep singing only when the heart still wants to speak. For Jimmy Fortune, that sense of sufficiency is not a destination, but a support that allows him to live more lightly through the rest of his life. He does not seek to front large charitable foundations or position himself as a symbol for loud campaigns. Instead, he lets music do the hardest work, standing beside those who are hurting. On stage, he does not preach hope. He tells the story of a life that has fallen and stood again. What he leaves behind is not numbers or slogans, but the feeling that pain can be seen, heard, and does not have to be endured alone. In recent years, when a bronze statue of him was erected in his hometown of Virginia, Jimmy Fortune did not receive it as a pinnacle. He saw it as a reminder of the road he had traveled longer than he ever thought he could endure. From a man who once sold cars to make a living, sang in bars no one remembered, entered a legendary band knowing he could be replaced at any moment, he is now remembered more for endurance than for titles. The statue does not freeze a victorious moment. It records the passage of time across a human life. Today, Jimmy Fortune does not try to make his life stand out. He stands on stage with a heart that has been stitched back together, carrying losses too great to fully tell, and sings as someone who still has something to say to life. And as long as that voice continues to rise, Jimmy Fortune's journey goes on quietly, but not yet finished. Overall, Jimmy Fortune's life is a series of moments that seemed ready to end everything. A poor childhood, years of anonymity, 2 failed marriages, life-threatening heart surgery, and the pain of losing a child. Yet what remains most memorable is not the tragedies themselves, but the way he refused to let them take the rest of his life. Jimmy keeps returning to music, quietly and persistently, like someone who understands that as long as there is breath, there is still a reason to sing. And if this story has touched you, leave a like, a comment, or simply stay with the channel a little longer. Thank you for listening all the way to the final moments.